Hi guys, my name's Grace. Thank you for watching this immigration story. In this first picture, this is my great-grandmother and I before she passed away, and me as a wee little child. In this photo, she's showing me the book that she authored about her life prior to her death, which also depicts our family's immigration story. Here's another picture of my family. This is my grandmother, great-grandmother, and great-grandfather, and I'll be tracing immigration policy and genealogy through Robert Matson Perry Jr., who's my great-grandfather, pictured here on the family tree. So his great-grandfather, Robert Perry, was born in Antrim in Northern Ireland, lived in Northern Ireland until he immigrated to America in his early 20s, right after he married Ellen Higgins Johnston. And they, with a group of people, immigrated in around 1840. The exact date is unknown, with their 9-month-old baby who barely made the journey over. It was a 3-month voyage, and unfortunately, the boat that they were on was supposed to land in Virginia, but due to some heavy winds and lack of technology and navigation skills, they somehow drifted into the Gulf of Mexico instead. And this photo isn't of my family, but it's of a group of Irish immigrants arriving at Ellis Island in the 1840s. So that would have been the same time period as my family would have arrived as well. So a little bit about Irish immigration to America. It's commonly known Ireland's 1840-1850 potato famine caused the death of millions of Irish people, and several million of those were able to flee to the United States to seek out a better life. And it's kind of a common misconception that this huge strike and huge rise in immigration was directly a result of the potato famine, but in reality, there were lots of Irish people that were immigrating to the United States prior to the 1840 potato famine. In 1841, 8.2 million Irish arrived in the US, and from 1820 to 1930, 4.5 million Irish arrived. Irish were composed of 1/3 of the immigrants to the United States from 1820 to 1860, and out of them, they were predominantly Catholic. And this illustration on the right here shows the potato famine. This is done by a famous artist. And one interesting thing about the potato being a staple for the Irish people is that I didn't realize that they literally ate it for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So this was incredibly detrimental to their health and well-being when there was the potato famine. As far as the mode of transport for most Irish people that were in the lower and middle class, they would have embarked on this 3,000-mile journey from Ireland to America on converted cargo ships. And this is ironic and equally depressing fact about these ships is that not very long before they were used to carry the Irish people across the same channel, they had been previously used to carry slaves. So these converted cargo ships were incredibly tight space and terrible living conditions. The average bed space per adult was only 18 inches. And the living conditions were so bad for these 3 months aboard the boats that 1/4 of the passengers did not survive the journey, which is what gave these ships the nickname of the coffin ships. And there's a quote from history.com. It says, "Their bodies were wrapped in cloths, weighed down with stones, and tossed overboard to sleep forever on the bed of the ocean floor." So unfortunately, the living conditions were so badly that 1/4 of the passengers didn't survive and gave them the coffin ships names. And there's another famous illustration of one of the coffin ships, and it shows how overcrowded these would have been. They also didn't have a good plumbing or sanitation facilities, so human feces would have been everywhere. There was very little clean drinking water, and food was not plentiful either. Unfortunately, a large part of what perpetuated the negative stereotype that Irish people faced once they arrived on America's shores was that they were poor and unskilled, which in large part was true because they were more in refugee status. So a lot of these people were in high school or in their early 20s and 30s and hadn't yet established a successful career in Ireland, and a lot of them were poor farmers that were fleeing and literally starving to get to death. So that stereotype of Irish people being poor and unskilled was largely true in this scenario. So my family in particular, after arriving in the Gulf of Mexico instead of Virginia on accident, found themselves in New Orleans. And from New Orleans, they took a smaller boat up the Mississippi River to the junction of the Missouri River. And from here, they took another boat and arrived in Knoxville, Illinois in July and sometime in the 1840s. Don't know the exact date. And here the Perrys had 7 boys and 2 girls in Illinois. In my family, genealogy will be traced through Sam, who was the middle boy raised in that family. And a little bit more about the policy and ideology of Irish immigrants during this time period. A New York newspaper editor famously quoted in 1841 saying, "The evil of immigration brings to these shores illiterate Roman Catholics, the obedient instruments of their more knowingly priestly leaders." So there are a lot of conspiracy theories circulating during this time period that Roman Catholic priests were coming together and devising a plan to overthrow democracy and Protestant leadership in the United States by sending these illiterate Roman Catholics to the US shores. And this largely became overturned once people did research on their own and saw that the Roman Catholics, this was not their intention, that they were just fleeing starvation in Ireland. But xenophobia, anti-Catholicism, and the nativist movement all were a result of this policy and ideology. The Know Nothing movement had pretty significant power in Congress during this time period, but that began to fade out once the Civil War became a more pressing problem. An example of the ideology and discrimination that occurred against the Irish people was in 1855, what is known as Bloody Monday. 22 of them were killed when a Know Nothing movement became very violent, and 22 people were killed on the streets. The Irish people did have a really high voting proportion for immigrants, and they were one of the groups that were able to utilize their right to vote as citizens of the United States in order to gain political standing. Unfortunately, as soon as this group did gain political standing, a lot of them used that voting power to then in turn show intolerance to the Japanese and Chinese in later decades. So it was the discrimination of one group lessened, in turn the discrimination of the people after them increased. And this early intolerance of the Irish essentially led to the Immigration Act of 1882, and the whole nativist movement as a whole led to Americans just wanting to restrict immigration in general and against both the Irish and the Japanese at that point. So for my family in particular, they struggled with finding an occupation because they had been farmers in Ireland, so they decided to try mining. It was really interesting looking at life in the mining world, so they ended up moving from Illinois to Colorado and working at the Moffett Coal Company in 1907. And here's a picture of the Moffett Coal Company, which was extremely successful mine. It was just known for a lot of violent occurrences. It's located in a really rural part of Colorado, so essentially a lot of crazy violent things happened, and a lot of books have been written about the miners and the violence that occurred here, and I'll share one of those stories later on. So this is my dad telling the story of Robert Matson Perry.
Dad, and I wanted to share a story about my great-grandfather, Robert Matson Perry. Robert was the son of Samuel Matson Perry, who owned the Oak Creek coal mine just outside of Steamboat. When he was 30 years old, 2 Greeks held him at gunpoint and marched him into the woods outside of his house. He spent 2 days walking through the woods, and finally on the second night, he was able to untie his hands and feet and was able to sneak over and take one of the guns from his 2 guards and told them to leave him alone. And one of them reached for a gun and he shot that one, and the other escaped into the mountains. He made it back to Steamboat, and we were able to read about it in this article in the Denver Post dated October 11th, 1916.
Awesome. So that's a really interesting story where he was able to escape kidnapping and as the superintendent of the Moffett mine in Oak Creek, Colorado. And I think that story really just speaks to the intensity and the violence in mining camps during that time period. And also that like wealth discrimination didn't really keep you from being safe, and that at some point even being wealthy like made you even more of a target, and that you couldn't buy your way to safety at this time period in the US. Analysis overall, the most interesting thing I found when doing this project was how intense the Protestant and Catholic divide was in the United States, and how that rippled into an effect and had like more significance in policy than I previously realized. I think that's a part of American history that we don't necessarily capitalize on, and when we're learning about the Irish immigration movement, and how much of a role that played and trickled into the Civil War politics, and even politics today. Also, just the mining, that it was very much high risk, high reward, that some of the most successful miners put their lives on the line. I was looking at the like average lifespan of people in like my own family and other families that were really involved in mining in the early Colorado days, and that the average lifespan was like 25 to 30 was normal. So these miners would put themselves in incredibly high risk situations, but the reward payout was also really high if they were successful. And that's it. Thank you for watching. There's my sources.